Hello and welcome. This is Ageless John teaching another Android Studio tutorial. Now before we go any further, I wanted to demonstrate yet again on the effect that you can use fragments for. I want to just totally delete all that code. Some of you may have thought it was a little confusing. Muddied the water, let us say. Made it hard to understand what was going on. So we'll get rid of that, and then we can see that it pulls activity my. So we're going to go there, activity my, and this is based on whether it's horizontal or vertical. And what I want you to do is just come in here and just delete that fragment, and that fills up the space. And then go in here and delete that fragment and fill up the space. There we go. All right, now run it and see what happens. One of the things I'd like to encourage you to do is to find and download other people's code and to explore that which has already been created by others that works, so that you can further understand how the code works. One of the places I would like to encourage you to look is here at developer.android.com samples. They have a lot of different samples codes available. I will put some links in the bottom of the page that will also be available, and places that you can go, one of them being Dartmouth, another one being another YouTuber, and they all have some code that you can download, and that code specifically will be a code used for to demonstrate more about fragments. One of the things I also wanted to show you was how to import code once you've downloaded it. You go to File, New, Import Project, then you have to find whatever directory that you had it in, and then you see these little green icons. Those are the projects that you can install. You just click on them and then OK, and they'll install. Now you may get a little blue message eventually and an error message down here at the bottom, and that if it's a blue link message, that means that there's something that's not installed on your computer or there's a problem. Rarely will I get one that I cannot install at all. Sometimes that does happen, but most of the time there's something missing on your installation, and it has to be either downloaded or the computer has to do an extra computation or something of that nature, and you just double click that blue button, that blue line, and that will take care of the issue a large majority of the time, at least in my personal experience. I'm going to be introducing the concept of dynamic layouts. Now, one of the things you may have noticed is that while these fragments that we've been working with are not terribly difficult, they are a little complicated. Now, if we call these to be statically created fragments, they are a little complicated, but they're easy to get used to. The ones that are much more complicated, at least in my opinion, are the dynamically created fragments that we're going to be working with next. This entire lesson is just going to be a little cleanup from the last tutorial with a little additional information, and then I'm going to leave you with an introductory of how the dynamics system works, and some very, very good resources that I suggest that you spend some time to look into. And then when we come back with our next tutorial, we'll go into in depth by creating and working with dynamically created fragment apps. So something to look forward to. All right, now if we want to go into our tutorial version of what we just created, I want to go to this page right here to activity_my XML, and this right here, this fragment, that is an indicator that this is statically created. It's simply embedding the fragments in the activities XML layout file with this fragment. Now, the second way is by adding the fragment dynamically in Java using what's called a Fragment Manager. The Fragment Manager class and the Fragment Transaction class allow you to add, remove, and replace fragments in the layout of your activity at runtime or anytime while the app is running. Adding a fragment to an activity is fairly easy when you're using XML, which we've discovered. However, this comes at a price, because when you do so, when you add it with XML, you can't remove it during the running of the activity. If you want to have complete dynamic control over your activity, you're going to have to be able to add fragments using the Java code. And there are there's a basic 6-step process for creating your own dynamic fragments, and I'll go into that in a second. Dynamic fragments. There's a 6-step process to creating a dynamic fragment. First, I'm going to show the line of code, then I'm going to talk about it for a second. It's fragment, first fragment equals new fragment. This is an example. First, you need to create an instance of the fragment class. For instance, if you had another class and it was called something else, it wouldn't be fragment 1, it'd be whatever class you've created. The next step is then you have to pass any intent arguments through to this class. And you can see this line, first argument dot set arguments, and then get intent, get extras. Third, you have to get a reference to the Fragment Manager instance. Here we see a Fragment Manager being called, assigned to Fragment Manager, and then equaling that get support Fragment Manager. Next, you have to call the begin transaction method on the Fragment Manager's instance, which will return a fragment transaction instance. And that's what this does. The fragment transaction to the variable transaction equals fragmanager.begin transaction. Fifth, you have to call the add method of the fragment transaction instance. You do this by passing it through as an argument. And I've indicated the little brackets here. Those show that this is part of the argument to the resource ID of the view that is going to contain the fragment and the fragment class instance. Finally, you have to call the commit method of the fragment transaction. And those are the 6 steps. Now you can compress the last 4 lines into a single line of code, and I'll just leave that there for a second. It's get support Fragment Manager, period, begin transaction, period, add, and then your arguments, and then commit. So that basically combines the last 4 lines of what we were talking about together. You will probably see both. Once added to a container, a fragment can be removed with a call to remove. It's like a bucket. Once you've got the fragment in the bucket, you can take it out again. You do it like this with the transaction.remove and then the first fragment. Okay, and this first fragment is, if you go back to the code before, it's referring to this transaction right here. The fragment transaction equals fragment. Fragments may be replaced by another with a call to replace method. And this takes the argument that the ID of the view containing the fragment and an instance of the new fragment. The old fragment can be pushed back into what's called the stack, so they can be quickly restored if it needed to be, using the add to backstack method of the fragment transaction object before the commit. And this code right here is an example of that. Fragment 2, second fragment equals new fragment 2, transaction replace, and then it's the r.id linear layout 1, second fragment, and then transaction 2 dot add to backstack, null, and then transaction dot commit. I wanted to thank you for joining me, and look forward to the next Android Studio tutorial, where we'll be covering more details on dynamic fragments and creation thereof. This has been Ageless John. Don't forget to subscribe and to thumbs up.